eliminating the possibility for mistakes beforehand is super important when you're setting up a bow. Those are just a few thoughts on keeping it simple.
It is literally everywhere. It's taken over. That'll be a never-ending project. Create some nice horizontal cover on this little ridge. It's a good project to get done.
Today on Midwest Whitetail, I'm going to talk about how I set up a whitetail hunting bow, and Jared Mills is going to talk about the value of timber stand improvement for small properties. So let me dive into this first. I started bow hunting when I was 14 years old, but didn't really get serious about it until about 1989. So about 30 years I've been chasing whitetails with a bow, and during that time I've gained a certain philosophy on how I hunt and what makes the most sense to me from an equipment standpoint. So my approach may be different than yours. So this isn't me saying this is how it has to be done. This is me explaining why certain trade-offs, I make them one way versus somebody else may choose the other side of the same trade-off. But at least we're going to talk about all that. We're going to talk about the equipment options and how that can make your hunting more successful, or in some cases hinder your chances for success. So let's start with the bow itself. Obviously, we love the Hoyt bows, and I've been shooting Hoyt for a long time, but whatever bow you prefer, the draw weight and the draw length are super important. And for me, I shoot the heaviest draw weight bow that I can handle accurately. And that makes sense to me because where I'm aiming at on a whitetail deer is close enough to that shoulder that if I miss just a little bit forward, I can still break through that shoulder and kill the deer. So everything I do with the bow and my setup is based on being able to get a kill on a shoulder hit. So anyway, my draw weight is fairly heavy. I'm not going to get into the exact number, but the point is it's about the most I can handle accurately. Draw length is one that can really have an effect on your accuracy. If you hit full draw, your elbow should be pointing straight away from the target. If your elbow is pointing a little bit if you're right-handed, right-handed to the right of the target line, your draw length is too short. If your elbow is pointing around behind you to the left of the target line, then your draw length is too long. So you hit full draw, arrow, your forearm and elbow straight in line with the arrow, straight in line with the target, your draw length is correct. So kind of keep that as a gauge. You can have somebody watch that for you. So if you get those two things right, then just about any good performance bow should be able to deliver an arrow accurately enough and with enough energy to kill a whitetail deer. So now let's look at the accessories and some of the trade-offs here. The sighting system is probably the most important aspect of the bow because everything you do relating to the target has to do with your sight picture. So I go with a large peep. This is a G5 Meta peep that I've got on this bow. I think it's a 1/4 inch diameter. They make a 1/4 and a 3/8. I like a big peep, and I couple that with a sight that has a round sight body. So at full draw, I'm not centering individual pins. I'm centering the sight body inside the peep. So that way I can still have good precision with a large peep. I like the large peep because it lets a lot of light through. So even in low light situations, I feel like I can get a pretty good sight picture. And the older I get, the more important that becomes because my ability to see well in low light has diminished over the years. So keep that in mind. The other thing I like about that is the peripheral vision, or the ability to see a bigger field of view. So if I've got a deer that's moving and I'm trying to time either the gap that I'm going to shoot through or when I'm going to make a noise to stop the deer, it's nice if your peep allows you to have a wide field of view. So again, the large peep makes sense. The round pin guard on the sight makes sense because that allows you to stay real precise with your aiming, even with that large peep. So getting back again to the sight, I'm a 5 fixed pin guy, and that's been the way I've shot for a long time. If I was only hunting whitetails, and I acquired this habit over the years from hunting other big game as well, but if I was only hunting whitetails, 3 pins would definitely be enough. The idea, of course, is to keep it simple. The more pins you've got, the more that potentially can affect your ability to think clearly and make the right choice during the excitement of the moment of truth. So a 3-pin sight set for 20, 30, 40 would be a real good choice, when it comes to the sight. I'm a big believer in lighted sight pins. I still believe, for me, that lighted pin is super important. It's legal where I hunt, obviously, but especially if I'm in a ground blind, it can be really hard to see your pins. Even in low light situations now, as I've gotten older, like I said, I don't see through the peep as well. So having that lighted pin is super important. So that makes a huge difference in my ability to execute during the moment of truth. Large peep, round pin guard. I use 5 pins, but lesser number of pins would be a good idea. And then the light. So the trade-off, and here's where I want to talk about that. I know there's a lot of people now that are going with these slider sights. And this is one that Fuse makes. It's a pretty simple system. You can roll the wheel, and the idea, of course, is that you take your rangefinder, you get the exact distance of the shot, you roll it to that exact distance, and then you use 1 pin for a 37-yard shot, and you put it right dead on. You don't have to estimate how much the arrow is going to drop if you use your 30-yard pin, and you don't have to gap. But the downside of that system occurs when the animal moves. You set it for 37 yards, you hit full draw, and in the process of that period of time, the deer takes 5 steps toward you. Now you're thinking, okay, he's probably about 30. Where am I going to put my 37-yard pin on a 30-yard shot? I've never liked that part, so that's why I never used the sliders. I always used fixed pins because I knew I had a 20, 30, 40. I knew right where I stood, even though the animal moved, once I hit full draw. So that's just a trade-off to keep in mind. But anyway, what Fuse did with theirs, they've got a 5-pin aperture, a 5-pin sight that's movable. So when you know the distance and you have time and you know the deer's not going to move, you could use the top pin or whichever pin you choose as your primary pin. And you can set it exactly right, and then you could put it dead on and shoot it as if it was a 1-pin slider. But the rest of the time you keep it set to that point where the top pin's at 20, and then if the deer's moving, you still got 20, 30, 40, whatever number of pins you've got on there. So that's a good compromise if you really like the idea of a slider, is to use one with a multi-pin body, and that gives you a lot more flexibility on shots where the animal's moving. The bubble level on the sight is another super important part of making the bow more reliable. If your bow is sighted in with the bow vertical and you tip it to the right, it's going to hit to the right. So having the bubble level, it just gives you, a small add-on to your accessory package that can make you a lot more accurate during the moment of truth. Now, let's talk about the quiver. I've got a Fuse quiver on here, and it's detachable. The quiver does have some effect on your accuracy. The bow tends to fall to the side of the quiver, as the arrow's moving forward. And the more arrows you have in there, the more it falls. So as you get less arrows, it's really only super critical on long shots, but it does have some effect even on, say, out to 40 yards. So rather than trying to figure out, okay, today I've got my quiver on, the next day I don't, where do I aim? I just always shoot with the quiver off. And the other thing also on that, by taking the quiver off, I reduce the profile of the bow. So if we have a crosswind and I'm holding the bow out and I've got a quiver full of arrows, the wind has got a lot more to push against, and that moves my arm around a lot more than if I just remove the quiver, set it in the tree or set it, hanging off a hook. Now that crosswind doesn't have near as much surface area to push against, so it doesn't have as much influence on where my sight pin ends up. So that's just one more trade-off. I am not a fan of wrist slings on a bow. I just feel like sometimes you have to get off a fast shot. For that reason, I like a bow that has a fairly small throat on the grip. So I can get into this one real easy and make a light touch between my thumb and my index finger. I don't have to squeeze it. I don't have to squeeze the grip. I can shoot it very loose-handed, and the bow, today's bows don't really jump very aggressively forward because of the way the limbs are built, and most of the recoil is up and down, so you don't get a lot of forward drive. But with a whitetail, 20-yard shot, 25-yard shot, timing is going to be the most critical part of your accuracy typically hunting whitetails. Next, I'm going to talk about the rest. And my rest selection, like everything else, serves a purpose. If you want to call it idiot proofing, that's kind of my term for, taking all of these aspects of the bow and making them as simple as possible to remove as many opportunities for failure. Whether it's just overly complex or basically something mechanical that you can do that makes your system more reliable, that makes the bow more idiot proof. And during the excitement of an encounter with a whitetail, I do become an idiot. And I wish I was a little bit more cold-blooded sometimes, but I can be an idiot. So eliminating the possibility for mistakes beforehand is super important when you're setting up a bow. And that's what this full containment rest does. This is the ultra rest from Fuse that I'm using here. And once I set that, you snap the arrow on the string and then flip the launcher up. Once I set that, no matter what I do after that, that arrow is always going to be where it needs to be. It's a drop away rest. So, as that smaller carbon arrow goes forward, the fletchings being close together, you don't have to worry about, sneaking them through the rest like you would in some designs. It falls away. You get really good arrow flight because there's nothing there to bump into the fletching. So I think the rest selection, using a drop away rest that has full containment, which this Fuse Ultra rest does, is super important. That serves a real purpose. It's not just arbitrary choice. Okay, now stabilizer. You can definitely shoot accurately without a stabilizer. If your bow will balance correctly without a stabilizer, this one does pretty good. I'd say it's for the most part pretty well balanced. In that situation, then the stabilizer doesn't make the bow more accurate because it doesn't really make it balance better. You want the bow to balance in your hand. Everybody's got their own philosophy on that. Some people want it to tip forward. I'm kind of a fan of having it balanced. The stabilizer now for me serves as more of a vibration and shock reducer, which makes the bow a little bit quieter, makes it a little bit more comfortable to shoot. Everything's rubber mounted. The weight on the end of the stabilizer moves independently of the stabilizer rod, so that will soak up some of the vibration of the bow. That's the most valuable purpose that the stabilizer serves for me as a whitetail hunter. Now let's look at the string. I'm using the America's Best bow strings now, and a custom string serves that finishing touch, that final component of the bow that increases the reliability. Again, we're talking about idiot proofing a bow. If you know that your nock set location, that your peep sight, all those things are super stable, that the string isn't going to twist, nothing is going to move, it's not going to creep, that just gives you an added level of reliability in the bow. So again, a custom string like the America's Best is a good investment. Just over time, that's just going to give you that extra peace of mind that one of the most important accessories on your bow isn't going to change during the season. Let's talk about the arrow real quick. Now the arrow itself is the Easton FMJ 5mm. I think this is the perfect arrow for whitetail hunting. I think it has the perfect weight to speed trade-off. Obviously you can go lighter and you're going to shoot faster, and that's going to help you maybe a little bit with some string jumping because you get there just a fraction sooner, and if the deer's dropping at the sound of the shot, he just doesn't drop quite as far. You might be able to get some benefits from a faster arrow. But with whitetail hunting, we're usually not taking very long shots. So range estimation errors and some of those other aspects of the shot aren't quite as critical as it would be for a Western hunter. So arrow speed isn't the most important factor. It's one of the considerations. It needs to be balanced. A little bit heavier arrow like this is going to increase penetration because it soaks up more of the energy from the bow. When you pull the bow back, you're putting energy into it. When you release the string, it's dumping that energy into the arrow. And a heavier arrow just soaks up more of that energy. So the bow becomes more efficient. The arrow carries a little bit more punch. The FMJ Full Metal Jacket has aluminum over carbon, so I feel like you get really good penetration with the smaller diameter, but you also because of the aluminum on the outside. It's real durable and very straight, and it seems like it gets a little bit better penetration because of less friction with the, with whatever you shoot it into because of that aluminum. Another important consideration on these smaller diameter arrows like this is wind drift. So if you're shooting in a crosswind, the bigger the arrow diameter, the more surface area the wind has to push against, and the more the arrow is going to drift. Same goes with the fletching. Being smaller, that's less surface area, the arrow diameter smaller, so on a crosswind I have less drift. Better penetration with the smaller diameter arrow and less drift on a crosswind. The Broadhead is the Wasp jackhammer, set for 1 3/8 diameter, I believe. This is a mechanical head, and over the years I've really settled in on these mechanical broadheads. Obviously I didn't start shooting them because there weren't any mechanical broadheads back when I really got serious about this, but over the years I've just gotten sold on the concept of being as accurate as I possibly can. If I make a rough release or my bow isn't perfectly tuned, I'm still going to get really good accuracy with the mechanical head. So again, like I said earlier, my whole setup is geared toward being able to kill them with a shoulder hit. So the Broadhead is geared for that, smaller diameter arrow, heavier draw weight on the bow. You don't need all that stuff to kill the whitetail if you hit them in the soft tissue. But if you do hit them in the shoulder, that little extra amount of punch is going to make a big difference between getting very little penetration or potentially even getting both lungs and getting a clean kill. One last thing I'll talk about. I'm going to talk about my release aid. So I switched to Spot Hog's Wise Guy just for that open hook. And the reason, it goes back to some of the things I've talked about already. My eyesight as I've gotten older isn't as good, and as it starts to get a little bit darker, it gets even worse. So for me, being able to clip a release onto the string became a lot more problematic. But with the string knocking loop, the only thing I found that I could do reliably was hook up the open hook. So I switched over to the Wise Guy, and that's the reason why. It's just another one of those trade-offs where it was making me less efficient during the moment of truth when I had to try to find that loop and close the jaws on that loop. With this, I can just put my thumb down, I can feel it, I can hook it up. I just did it without even looking. So that's another consideration. But like I said, going straight to the string with a caliper release is not a bad option either. I did that for years. So I think I've covered everything on my bow and my arrows, why I use what I use. And again, just to make one last final comment about this, these are my trade-offs. And it really focuses on my philosophy that if I hit them in the shoulder, I still want to kill them. Not everybody's going to have that same mindset. Some people love the idea of, just being fast, hitting them in the soft tissue with a big broadhead, and shortening up the potential blood trail on a soft tissue hit. And I understand that. If you tell me where I'm going to hit the deer on the next shot, I'll change everything I carry to go along with that. But as long as it's unknown, I'm still going to set my gear up for the worst case scenario, which for me is hitting them in the shoulder. So that's why I carry what I do. And now we're going to join Jared Mills talking about timber stand improvement on a small property.
This morning I was on Mike and I's farm getting a little work done. I seeded some pure trophy clover in a spot that I think is a likely place to get a shot at Marino if he's around this year. So that was good to get that project done. But now I'm on a small property that I have permission to hunt. It's about 70 acres, and my goal is to somehow make it hunt bigger. This is a very typical scenario where you have a small property and there's a ton of hunting pressure around. During shotgun season, guys literally line up on the fence line and drive deer. So, something that I know a lot of guys deal with, but, my goal is to create more cover on this farm and make it hunt bigger and get it to hold more deer, essentially. So I'm going to focus a lot of time on this farm this year, and I'm going to start with this little ridge. There's a ton of work that needs done on this farm, including controlling some of the invasives, like the bush honeysuckle has taken over this farm like I've never seen before. And then, there just hasn't been any timber improvement work done on this farm, so there's a ton to do, but I'm going to focus my time on one small ridge to start with. I got to start somewhere, so I'm going to start on the small ridge. Here I'm going to focus on releasing a few of the good oaks on this little spot, and I picked this spot because I think it's a really huntable spot. There's a lot of beds on here already, but the way this ridge sets up, there's a ditch that comes up to the top, and they cross the fence right up here over to this little kind of an old roadway basically, and there's this internal fence, so they're crossing right here, and there's a lot of good stand options, good access down that old roadway, and I just think it would be a good spot, especially come November. So I'm gonna focus on this spot. Like I said, there's so much work to be done on this property. I decided I need to focus on something small and at least get a start. So I'm gonna start cutting down some of these trees. I'm gonna hinge cut some of them just to create a little more horizontal cover. I think there's some hickories and stuff that should lay down nicely. And there's a couple good looking oaks, like I said, that I'm gonna release, and then take care of some of this bush honeysuckle. So I'm gonna get started marking some of the oaks and get to work. All right, we've been at it for a few hours here, and it's a good project to get done. Created some nice horizontal cover on this little ridge. Hinge cut some of the hickories, girdled some of the bigger locusts, and we freed up a couple really good oaks. And then this oak right here is the best stand site. So what's nice about this tree, really good entry and exit on this old roadway. Can blow a south or southeast wind up the road and be undetected, but also I really think I could get away with a west wind blowing over the top of the deer, because this is the very top of the ridge and it drops off a long ways and really steep. So I think the deer walking on this up side of the ridge, the wind will blow right over the top of them. So a lot of wind options with this tree too. So I'm excited to spend some time in this tree this fall. I know that there's some good deer that roll through here. I ran cameras hard on this property 2 years ago and had some good bucks. So excited to spend some more time on this piece and keep improving it.
Well, that's it for this week. I appreciate you joining me. We'll see you right back here again next week for the next episode of Midwest Whitetail. And remember to always dream big.